Welcome back to The Sleep Detective, where we dive deep into the psychological mysteries that shape criminal minds. I'm your host, and tonight we're beginning our analysis of one of America's most psychologically disturbing serial killers, Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker. Over the next 3 hours, we'll explore how childhood trauma, family dysfunction, and environmental factors combined to create a predator who terrorized Los Angeles in the 1980s. Before we explore Ramirez's psychology, I want you to become an active profiler again. Based on what you'll learn about his psychological development, put in the comments your prediction for this challenge. What do you think was the primary psychological trigger that transformed Richard from a troubled child into an active predator? We'll reveal the answer in segment 6, and I'll read the most insightful predictions from your comments. Now, close your eyes and imagine you're the FBI profiler assigned to understand Ricardo Leyva Muz Ramirez. You're examining crime scenes that seem random and chaotic, trying to understand the mind behind attacks that appear motiveless. What you're about to discover will reveal that even the most seemingly disorganized criminal behavior has deep psychological roots. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, into a family environment that would prove psychologically devastating for his developing mind. His birth on Leap Day, a date that only exists every 4 years, would later become part of his grandiose self-image. But the family circumstances surrounding his early life were creating the psychological foundation for extreme violence. Ricardo was the youngest of 5 children born to Julian and Mercedes Ramirez, and his position as the baby of the family placed him in a unique psychological situation. His father, Julian, was a former Mexican police officer whose own psychological makeup was characterized by extreme violence and unpredictable rage. The household environment was dominated by fear, brutality, and psychological chaos. Julian Ramirez's parenting style was characterized by what child psychologists call authoritarian abuse with unpredictable violence. He would beat his children severely for minor infractions, creating an environment where violence was normalized as a method of control and communication. Young Richard's developing brain was learning that power came through inflicting pain and fear on others. The psychological impact of growing up in an extremely violent household was compounded by the family's economic struggles and social isolation. The Ramirez family lived in poverty in a rough neighborhood where violence was commonplace, and Richard's psychology was absorbing the message that the world was a dangerous place where only the strong survived through brutality and cunning. Richard's relationship with his mother Mercedes was psychologically complex and damaging in different ways than his father's violence. Mercedes was described as deeply religious, but also emotionally distant and unable to protect her children from their father's rage. Richard's psychology was learning that even those who were supposed to love and protect him were either violent or powerless. The psychological foundation being laid in Richard's early childhood was characterized by what experts call normalized violence with powerlessness compensation. His developing mind was learning that violence was normal and acceptable while simultaneously feeling completely powerless to protect himself or control his environment. This combination would later manifest in his need to terrorize and control others. Richard's academic performance was poor from an early age, not necessarily due to lack of intelligence, but because of the psychological trauma and chaos in his home environment. His inability to concentrate or connect with authority figures was creating additional feelings of inadequacy and failure that would contribute to his growing psychological problems. The family's frequent moves during Richard's childhood created what psychologists call attachment disruption with social isolation, Each new school and neighborhood meant starting over without the stability necessary for healthy psychological development. Richard was becoming increasingly isolated and withdrawn, developing the loner mentality that would characterize his later criminal behavior. Richard's early exposure to drug use began in elementary school, not as typical experimentation, but as psychological self-medication for the trauma and chaos in his life. His developing brain was learning to use substances to escape psychological pain, creating patterns of addiction that would later amplify his violent tendencies and impair his judgment. The psychological impact of Richard's family's religious environment was particularly damaging given the contradiction between religious teachings and the violence in his home. The cognitive dissonance between Christian values of love and forgiveness and the daily reality of brutal violence was creating psychological confusion about morality and right and wrong. Richard's exposure to his cousin Miguel's war stories and photographs from Vietnam was psychologically significant in ways that wouldn't become clear until later. Miguel had served as a Green Beret and returned with severe psychological trauma that he expressed through graphic stories of violence and photographs of atrocities he had committed. Richard's psychology was being exposed to violence as entertainment and accomplishment. The relationship between Richard and his cousin Miguel was characterized by what psychologists call trauma bonding with violence glorification. Miguel became a father figure and role model for Richard, but the lessons he was teaching involved the celebration of brutality, the dehumanization of victims, and the psychological satisfaction that could be gained from inflicting suffering. Miguel's influence on Richard's developing psychology was particularly dangerous because it provided a framework for understanding violence not as something shameful or wrong, but as something powerful and admirable. Miguel's war stories gave Richard a narrative structure for understanding violence as heroic and exciting rather than traumatic and wrong. The psychological development we see in Richard's early childhood was creating what experts call violence normalization with powerlessness rage. His mind was learning that violence was normal and even admirable, while he remained powerless and victimized. This combination was building psychological pressure that would eventually need an outlet. Richard's behavioral problems in school were manifestations of the psychological trauma he was experiencing at home. His inability to form healthy relationships with peers or authority figures was creating additional isolation and reinforcing his developing antisocial tendencies. Each failure in normal social interaction was pushing him further toward the margins of society. The family dynamics in the Ramirez household were characterized by what psychologists call multi-generational trauma with violence transmission. The violence and dysfunction weren't limited to Richard's immediate family, but were part of a pattern that had been passed down through generations, creating a toxic environment where psychological healing was impossible. Richard's early fascination with dark imagery and violent themes wasn't typical childhood interest in scary stories, but rather a psychological manifestation of his trauma and growing identification with violence and power. His psychology was beginning to find comfort and excitement in images and ideas that should have been disturbing. The psychological foundation being created in Richard's mind during these early years was like a bomb being assembled piece by piece. The violence, trauma, dysfunction, and exposure to criminal thinking were combining to create a psychology that was perfectly primed for predatory behavior. His mind was learning to associate violence with power, fear with control, and suffering with satisfaction. Richard's physical development during childhood was also psychologically significant. He was often sick and smaller than his peers, creating additional feelings of powerlessness and inadequacy that his psychology would later compensate for through violence and intimidation. His physical vulnerability was contributing to his psychological need to make others feel vulnerable and afraid. The religious environment in the Ramirez household was creating what psychologists call moral confusion with spiritual emptiness. The contradiction between religious teachings and family behavior was making it impossible for Richard to develop healthy moral reasoning or spiritual grounding. Instead, his psychology was developing a fascination with the dark and forbidden. Richard's early exposure to pornography and sexual violence through his cousin Miguel was psychologically devastating for his developing sexuality and understanding of relationships. His psychology was learning to associate sex with violence and dominance rather than love and connection, creating patterns that would later manifest in his crimes. The psychological analysis of Richard's childhood reveals that by age 10, his mind had been shaped by experiences that had normalized violence, glorified brutality, and created deep feelings of powerlessness and rage. His psychology was developing along a trajectory that would make violence not only possible but psychologically necessary for him to feel powerful and in control. The neighborhood environment where Richard grew up was reinforcing the lessons he was learning at home. The streets of his El Paso neighborhood were characterized by poverty, crime, and violence, providing additional models of antisocial behavior and criminal thinking. His psychology was absorbing the message that normal society had nothing to offer him. Richard's relationship with his siblings was characterized by what psychologists call trauma bonding with competitive victimization. All the children were being abused and traumatized, but rather than supporting each other, they were competing for survival and developing individual coping mechanisms that often involved turning the violence outward. The psychological foundation laid in Richard's childhood was creating what experts call predatory psychology with supernatural ideation. His developing mind was not only learning to see violence as normal and desirable, but was also beginning to develop grandiose fantasies about his own power and specialness that would later manifest in his belief that he was chosen for a dark mission. By his early teens, Richard's psychological development had created a mind that was perfectly equipped for predatory behavior. His childhood experiences had taught him that violence was normal, that power came through terrorizing others, and that conventional morality was meaningless. His psychology was ready to begin the transition from victim to victimizer, setting the stage for the development of one of America's most feared serial killers. You're still the profiler, and now we're examining how Richard Ramirez's traumatic childhood experiences crystallized into a fully formed antisocial personality during his teenage years. What you're about to explore is the psychological transformation of a damaged child into a predator, revealing how adolescent experiences can either heal or amplify childhood trauma. This is the critical period where intervention might have been possible. Richard's entry into adolescence was marked by what forensic psychologists call trauma amplification with identity confusion. The psychological damage from his childhood was being magnified by the normal stresses of teenage development, creating a volatile combination of hormonal changes, identity formation, struggles, and unresolved trauma that his mind was ill-equipped to handle constructively. The influence of his cousin Miguel intensified during Richard's early teens, creating what experts call criminal mentorship with violence indoctrination. Miguel wasn't just telling war stories anymore, he was actively teaching Richard criminal techniques, survival skills, and a worldview that glorified violence and predation. This mentorship was providing structure and identity for Richard's developing antisocial personality. Richard's academic performance continued to deteriorate throughout his teenage years, not due to lack of intelligence, but because his psychology was becoming increasingly disconnected from conventional social institutions. School represented authority, rules, and social expectations that his developing antisocial personality was rejecting as meaningless constraints on his personal freedom. The psychological analysis of Richard's peer relationships during this period reveals what experts call social isolation with predatory observation. He was becoming increasingly isolated from normal teenage social groups while developing an intense interest in observing and studying other people's vulnerabilities. His psychology was learning to see others as potential victims rather than potential friends. Richard's drug use escalated significantly during his teenage years, progressing from marijuana to harder substances including cocaine and PCP. This escalation represented what forensic psychologists call chemical disinhibition with reality detachment. The drugs weren't just providing escape from psychological pain, they were removing the remaining barriers between his violent fantasies and potential action. The psychological impact of Richard's physical development during adolescence was significant for his emerging personality structure. As he grew larger and stronger, his psychology was developing what experts call physical empowerment with intimidation discovery. He was learning that his physical presence could make others uncomfortable or afraid, and this discovery was psychologically intoxicating. Richard's relationship with authority figures during his teenage years was characterized by what psychologists call systematic defiance with control rejection. He wasn't just rebelling against rules, he was developing a fundamental rejection of any external control over his behavior. His psychology was becoming organized around the principle of absolute personal autonomy, regardless of social consequences. The religious confusion that had characterized Richard's childhood intensified during his teenage years into what experts call spiritual inversion with dark fascination. Instead of finding comfort in conventional religion, his psychology was becoming attracted to dark spiritual practices, occult imagery, and the idea that evil could be a source of power rather than something to be avoided. Richard's first serious criminal activities began during his mid-teens, starting with what forensic psychologists call transgression testing with boundary exploration. He was systematically testing social and legal boundaries to see what he could get away with, while his psychology was evaluating how much power and control he could exert over others through intimidation and violence. The psychological development we see in Richard during this period is what experts call antisocial consolidation with predatory specialization. His personality was becoming organized around the pursuit of power and control through intimidation, manipulation, and violence. Normal teenage activities and relationships held no appeal for his developing antisocial psychology. Richard's fascination with nighttime activities during his teenage years was psychologically significant beyond typical teenage rebellion. His psychology was developing what experts call darkness affinity with predatory timing. He was learning that nighttime provided opportunities for activities that were impossible or too risky during daylight hours, and this discovery was shaping his emerging criminal methodology. The psychological analysis of Richard's family relationships during adolescence reveals what experts call victim-to-predator transition with family detachment. He was evolving from being primarily a victim of family violence to becoming a source of threat and intimidation within the household. His psychology was reversing the power dynamics that had characterized his childhood. Richard's exposure to pornography and violent imagery intensified during his teenage years, creating what forensic psychologists call fantasy amplification with reality contamination. The violent sexual imagery wasn't just entertainment for his developing mind, it was becoming a template for understanding power, control, and the relationship between sex and violence. The psychological impact of Richard's increasing criminal sophistication was creating what experts call success reinforcement with escalation pressure. Each successful criminal act, theft, intimidation, assault, was providing psychological validation of his antisocial worldview while creating pressure to attempt more serious and dangerous crimes. Richard's development of his signature thousand-yard stare during this period was psychologically significant as what experts call intimidation weaponization with emotional detachment. His psychology was learning to use his facial expressions and body language as tools for creating fear and asserting dominance over others, while simultaneously developing the emotional detachment necessary for predatory behavior. The psychological analysis of Richard's sleep patterns during adolescence reveals what experts call circadian disruption with nocturnal adaptation. His natural sleep rhythms were shifting toward increased nighttime activity, not just due to teenage rebellion, but because his psychology was becoming adapted to operating in darkness when normal social constraints were reduced. Richard's relationship with his extended family during this period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call criminal networking with violence normalization. His interactions with relatives involved in criminal activities were providing additional models of antisocial behavior while reinforcing the message that conventional morality was for people who lacked the courage to take what they wanted. The psychological development of Richard's capacity for violence during his teenage years was characterized by what experts call aggression escalation with emotional numbing. His ability to inflict pain and suffering was increasing, while his emotional response to others' pain was decreasing. His psychology was developing the emotional detachment necessary for systematic predation. Richard's fascination with serial killers and violent criminals during this period wasn't typical teenage interest in crime stories. It was what forensic psychologists call role model identification with methodology study. His psychology was studying criminal behavior not as something horrifying, but as something to be understood, admired, and potentially emulated. The psychological analysis of Richard's emerging worldview during adolescence reveals what experts call antisocial philosophy with supernatural justification. He was developing a coherent belief system that justified violence and predation as natural expressions of superior individuals who weren't bound by conventional moral constraints. This philosophy was providing psychological framework for escalating criminal behavior. Richard's increasing comfort with causing fear in others was creating what forensic psychologists call terror deployment with psychological satisfaction. His developing personality was learning to derive pleasure not just from getting what he wanted, but from the process of making others afraid. Fear was becoming both a tool and a reward in his psychological system. The psychological impact of Richard's drug use on his developing personality was characterized by what experts call chemical personality integration with violence disinhibition. The substances weren't just affecting his behavior temporarily, they were becoming integrated into his personality structure, permanently altering his capacity for empathy, impulse control, and moral reasoning. Richard's development of criminal versatility during his teenage years demonstrates what forensic psychologists call adaptive antisocial learning with specialization resistance. His psychology was becoming skilled at multiple types of criminal activity rather than specializing in one area, suggesting a fundamental orientation toward predation rather than specific criminal goals. The psychological analysis of Richard's relationship with violence during this period reveals what experts call brutality normalization with escalation inevitability. Violence was no longer something that happened to him or something he witnessed. It was becoming his primary method of interacting with the world and solving problems. Richard's personality by his late teens had developed what forensic psychologists call integrated antisocial functionality with predatory readiness. His childhood trauma had been transformed into a comprehensive system for identifying, approaching, and victimizing others. His personality structure was complete and ready for the transition from petty crime to systematic predation that would soon make him one of America's most feared serial killers. You're examining the most crucial phase of Richard's transformation, the period where damaged psychology crosses into active predatory behavior. This is where the troubled teenager begins his final transition into the Night Stalker. The first documented manifestation of Richard's dark impulses occurred around age 15. He began systematic animal torture with psychological experimentation. This wasn't impulsive childhood cruelty. This was methodical, planned, and increasingly sophisticated. Richard would capture neighborhood cats and dogs, then experiment with different methods of causing prolonged suffering. Each act of cruelty was systematically destroying his capacity for empathy while providing him with an addictive sense of complete power. His methods revealed escalating sophistication with experimental methodology. He wasn't randomly cruel. He was developing techniques, testing approaches, and refining his ability to cause maximum psychological and physical trauma. This systematic approach would later become his criminal hallmark. The psychological pleasure Richard derived from animal torture was creating violence reward pathways with addiction formation. His brain was literally rewiring itself to associate violence with intense pleasure, creating a biological need for increasingly extreme stimulation. Richard's first experiences with breaking and entering weren't about theft or vandalism. The psychological motivation was power demonstration with boundary violation. He was learning that he could penetrate other people's private spaces and that this violation provided psychological satisfaction. His early burglary behavior revealed intimate invasion with psychological possession. He wasn't just taking material objects. He was studying victims' personal belongings, learning their routines, and psychologically absorbing the details of their private lives. Richard's relationship with his own reflection during this period was psychologically significant. He would spend hours staring at himself in mirrors, not out of vanity, but because he was watching his own transformation. His psychology was observing something new and dangerous emerging. The psychological impact of Richard's increasing drug use was characterized by chemical disinhibition with reality detachment. The substances weren't just providing escape from psychological pain. They were removing the remaining barriers between his violent fantasies and his willingness to act on them. Richard's first sexual fantasies were immediately intertwined with violence in what experts call sexuality contamination with aggression fusion. Unlike normal adolescent sexual development, Richard's sexuality was being shaped by violence and his growing need for control and domination. The psychological analysis of Richard's sleep patterns reveals darkness affinity with predatory timing. He was becoming increasingly nocturnal, not just due to teenage rebellion, but because his psychology was developing an affinity for the psychological state that darkness created. Richard's relationship with his cousin Miguel intensified during this period into criminal mentorship with violence glorification. Miguel wasn't just telling stories anymore. He was actively teaching Richard criminal techniques, survival skills, and a worldview that celebrated violence as power and identity. The psychological development we see in Richard during this period is fantasy crystallization with reality preparation. His violent thoughts were becoming increasingly detailed and specific, while his real-world behavior was developing the skills and confidence necessary to transform fantasies into actions. Richard's first experience with serious violence against humans occurred during a neighborhood altercation when he was 16. The psychological significance wasn't just that he was willing to fight. It was violence escalation with satisfaction discovery. He continued attacking his opponent long after the threat was neutralized, and he derived obvious pleasure from the fear and pain he was causing. The psychological impact was threshold crossing with addiction confirmation. Violence against people provided more intense psychological satisfaction than animal torture. Richard's academic performance wasn't just poor. It was institutional rejection with authority defiance. He wasn't failing because of lack of intelligence, but because his psychology was actively rejecting any system that tried to control or direct his behavior. The psychological analysis of Richard's peer relationships reveals social isolation with predatory observation. He was becoming increasingly isolated from normal teenage social groups while developing an intense interest in studying other people's vulnerabilities, habits, and weaknesses. Richard's relationship with his immediate family was characterized by victim-to-predator transition with family intimidation. He was evolving from being primarily a victim of family violence to becoming a source of threat and fear within the household. The psychological development of Richard's capacity for deception was characterized by manipulation sophistication with emotional camouflage. He was learning to present different faces to different people, to hide his true thoughts and intentions, and to manipulate others' perceptions of him. Richard's first experiences with theft weren't motivated by material need, but by power demonstration with victim selection. He was learning to identify vulnerable targets, to time his attacks for maximum success, and to derive psychological satisfaction from taking what belonged to others. The psychological analysis of Richard's emerging worldview reveals antisocial philosophy with supernatural justification. He was developing a belief system that portrayed violence and predation as natural expressions of superior individuals who weren't bound by conventional moral constraints. Richard's increasing comfort with causing fear in others was creating terror deployment with psychological satisfaction. His developing personality was learning to derive pleasure not just from getting what he wanted, but from the process of making others afraid. The psychological impact of Richard's exposure to violent pornography was characterized by fantasy amplification with reality contamination. The violent sexual imagery wasn't just entertainment for his developing mind. It was becoming a template for understanding power, control, and the relationship between sex and violence. Richard's development of his signature intimidation tactics was psychologically significant as fear weaponization with dominance assertion. His psychology was learning to use his physical presence, facial expressions, and verbal threats as tools for creating psychological terror in others. The psychological analysis of Richard's relationship with conventional morality reveals moral inversion with ethical nihilism. He wasn't just rejecting traditional moral teachings. He was developing a belief system that portrayed conventional morality as weakness and celebrated cruelty as strength. Richard's first experiences with stalking behavior were characterized by victim surveillance with psychological possession. He would follow people, learn their routines, and study their vulnerabilities not necessarily with immediate criminal intent, but because the knowledge provided psychological satisfaction. The psychological development we see in Richard by age 17 was predatory readiness with violence, hunger. His childhood trauma had been transformed into a comprehensive system for identifying, approaching, and victimizing others. His dark impulses were driving him toward increasingly serious criminal behavior. Richard's psychology during this period was characterized by empathy elimination with cruelty celebration. The normal human capacity for feeling others' pain had been completely destroyed, replaced by a psychology that derived pleasure from causing suffering. The psychological analysis of Richard's emotional state reveals emotional numbing with violence sensitivity. He was becoming increasingly unable to feel normal human emotions like love, joy, or contentment, while simultaneously becoming hypersensitive to opportunities for violence and control. By his late teens, Richard's psychology had developed integrated antisocial functionality with predatory specialization. His dark impulses had evolved from random cruelty into a systematic approach to identifying and exploiting human vulnerability. The Night Stalker was psychologically ready to begin his reign of terror. You're now examining the environmental factors that transformed Richard from a psychologically damaged teenager into an active predator. This is where external circumstances interact with predisposed psychology to create the perfect storm for serial killing. The most significant environmental trigger occurred when Richard was 18 and witnessed his cousin Miguel murder his wife Jessie in a domestic dispute. This was murder normalization with family perpetration. Richard watched someone he looked up to commit the ultimate act of violence. Miguel's casual attitude afterward taught Richard that killing was just another form of problem solving. The psychological impact was homicide desensitization with methodology absorption. Richard didn't react with horror as a normal person would. Instead, his psychology absorbed the experience as educational. He studied Miguel's technique, his emotional state during the killing, and his behavior afterward. Richard treated the murder as a learning opportunity rather than a traumatic event. This response revealed how completely his psychology had been corrupted by years of violence exposure. Miguel's arrest and imprisonment following the murder created mental void with escalation pressure. Richard had lost his primary criminal role model and psychological anchor just as his own violent impulses were reaching their peak. This loss forced his psychology to develop its own methods. The family's response to Miguel's crime was psychologically significant as violence normalization with victim blaming. Instead of expressing horror at the murder, family members focused on Miguel's war trauma and Jessie's supposed provocations. Richard learned that even murder could be justified. Richard's relocation to Los Angeles in 1982 represented geographic disinhibition with anonymity empowerment. Moving to a large city where he had no established identity or social connections removed the remaining social constraints on his behavior. He could be anyone and do anything. The psychological impact of Los Angeles itself was urban predator optimization with victim abundance. The city provided everything Richard's psychology needed to begin systematic predation. Abundant potential victims, diverse neighborhoods to hide in, and urban anonymity that made tracking difficult. Richard's discovery of the Los Angeles drug scene was chemical disinhibition with reality detachment acceleration. The readily available cocaine and PCP weren't just providing escape from psychological pain. They were removing the final barriers between his violent fantasies and his willingness to act. The psychological analysis of Richard's early experiences in Los Angeles reveals predatory experimentation with boundary testing. He was systematically testing what he could get away with in this new environment, starting with petty crimes and gradually escalating to more serious offenses. Richard's first apartment in Los Angeles was psychologically significant as predatory base establishment with identity construction. For the first time in his life, he had complete privacy and autonomy. This physical space became a psychological laboratory where he could plan crimes without interference. The psychological impact of Richard's employment struggles was legitimate failure with criminal validation. His inability to maintain regular employment wasn't just about poor work ethic. It was confirmation that conventional society had nothing to offer him. Each job failure pushed him toward criminal activity. Richard's discovery of Los Angeles nightlife was nocturnal affinity with predatory timing optimization. The city's 24-hour culture provided perfect cover for his increasingly nocturnal activities. He was learning the rhythms of when people were most vulnerable and when police presence was reduced. The psychological analysis of Richard's relationship with Los Angeles drug culture reveals chemical community integration with criminal networking. The drug scene wasn't just providing him with substances. It was connecting him with other criminals, teaching him advanced criminal techniques, and normalizing increasingly extreme behavior. Richard's first serious burglaries in Los Angeles were characterized by crime technique refinement with psychological satisfaction amplification. Each successful break-in wasn't just about stolen goods. It was about perfecting his ability to penetrate other people's private spaces and demonstrating his power over their security. The psychological impact of Richard's increasing success at crime was criminal confidence building with escalation momentum. Each successful burglary, theft, or assault was providing psychological validation of his antisocial worldview while creating pressure to attempt more serious and dangerous crimes. Richard's development of his signature crime methodology was predatory specialization with terror integration. He wasn't just committing crimes for material gain. He was developing a comprehensive approach to maximizing psychological terror in his victims while minimizing his own risk of capture. The psychological analysis of Richard's victim selection process reveals vulnerability assessment with predatory optimization. He was learning to identify the most vulnerable targets, to time his attacks for maximum advantage, and to choose victims who were least likely to resist effectively. Richard's first experiences with serious violence in Los Angeles were characterized by escalation, confirmation with satisfaction, validation. The violence wasn't just instrumental to his crimes. It was becoming an end in itself, providing psychological satisfaction that material theft couldn't match. The psychological impact of Richard's exposure to Los Angeles serial killer culture was criminal role model multiplication with methodology diversification. The city's history of serial killers provided him with multiple examples of successful predatory behavior, and his psychology was studying these cases as educational material. Richard's relationship with the Los Angeles police response to his early crimes was law enforcement evaluation with countermeasure development. He was systematically studying police procedures, response times, and investigation methods, using this knowledge to refine his criminal techniques. The psychological analysis of Richard's living situation reveals social isolation with predatory focus intensification. His increasing isolation from normal social connections was allowing his psychology to focus entirely on criminal planning and fantasy development without the moderating influence of conventional relationships. Richard's discovery of Satan worship and occult practices was spiritual inversion with evil identification. The occult wasn't just providing him with an alternative belief system. It was giving him a philosophical framework that celebrated the very impulses conventional morality condemned. The psychological impact of Richard's adoption of satanic symbolism was evil empowerment with moral inversion. The pentagram, satanic imagery, and occult practices weren't just aesthetic choices. They were becoming integral to his identity and providing psychological justification for increasingly extreme behavior. Richard's first murders were triggered by environmental opportunity convergence with psychological readiness. All the psychological preparation, criminal skill development, and environmental factors came together in a perfect storm that made killing not just possible but inevitable. The psychological analysis of Richard's transition from burglar to killer reveals crime evolution with violence integration. Murder wasn't a departure from his previous criminal behavior. It was the logical next step in an escalating pattern of predatory behavior that had been building for years. Richard's early killing spree was characterized by homicide experimentation with technique refinement. Each murder was teaching him something new about killing, about victim psychology, about police response, and about his own capabilities and limitations. The psychological impact of Richard's first taste of murder was ultimate transgression with psychological liberation. Killing represented the final boundary crossed, the ultimate expression of his power over others, and the complete rejection of all social constraints on his behavior. Richard's development of his signature crime scene behaviors was terror signature with psychological branding. The satanic symbols, the specific types of violence, and the psychological terror he inflicted weren't just random cruelty. They were becoming his psychological signature. The psychological analysis of Richard's emotional state during this period reveals predatory fulfillment with escalation, hunger. He had found his true calling in systematic predation and murder, but his psychology was already demanding more extreme stimulation to maintain the same level of satisfaction. Richard's relationship with media coverage of his crimes was notoriety, intoxication with legend, construction. The fear and attention his crimes generated wasn't just satisfying his ego. It was becoming an integral part of his psychological motivation to continue and escalate his criminal behavior. You're now analyzing how Richard Ramirez transformed from a chaotic criminal into a systematic predator. This is where we examine the development of his signature methodology that would terrorize Los Angeles and define his criminal legacy. Richard's early crimes in Los Angeles were characterized by what forensic psychologists call technique experimentation with efficiency optimization. He was systematically testing different approaches to breaking and entering, studying what worked and what didn't, and refining his methods based on real-world results. His first breakthrough in criminal methodology was developing what experts call silent entry mastery with detection avoidance. Richard became obsessed with entering homes without making any noise, studying lock mechanisms, window latches, and door construction until he could penetrate most residential security systems. The psychological significance of Richard's focus on silent entry was power demonstration with victim vulnerability exploitation. He wasn't just trying to avoid detection. He was learning to appear in people's most private spaces like a ghost, maximizing their psychological terror when they discovered his presence. Richard's victim selection process evolved into what forensic psychologists call systematic vulnerability assessment with predatory optimization. He would spend hours studying potential targets, learning their routines, identifying their weaknesses, and timing his attacks for maximum advantage and minimum risk. His methodology for choosing victims revealed what experts call demographic diversification with psychological experimentation. Richard deliberately targeted different types of people, young and old, male and female, different ethnicities, to test how different victims would respond to his attacks. The psychological analysis of Richard's crime timing reveals what forensic psychologists call nocturnal predation with circadian exploitation. He understood that people were most vulnerable during deep sleep hours, that police response was slower at night, and that darkness provided natural camouflage for his activities. Richard's development of his signature weapon preferences was characterized by what experts call tool selection with psychological amplification. He didn't just choose weapons for their effectiveness. He selected items that would maximize his victims' fear and demonstrate his complete control over their lives and deaths. His fascination with different types of knives revealed what forensic psychologists call blade psychology with intimidation specialization. Richard studied how different knife types affected his victims' psychological responses, learning which weapons created the most terror and which gave him the most psychological satisfaction. The psychological significance of Richard's evolving sexual violence methodology was characterized by what experts call sadistic refinement with control intensification. Each assault taught him new techniques for maximizing his victim's psychological and physical suffering while satisfying his increasingly complex and disturbing sexual fantasies. Richard's development of his signature verbal threats and psychological torture techniques revealed what forensic psychologists call terror communication with mind control experimentation. He learned exactly what words and phrases would create maximum psychological impact on his victims. His methodology for controlling multiple victims simultaneously was characterized by what experts call group dynamics exploitation with fear management. Richard developed techniques for managing the psychological terror of multiple people, using their fear of each other's death to ensure compliance. The psychological analysis of Richard's crime scene behavior reveals what forensic psychologists call signature evolution with psychological branding. His use of satanic symbols, specific positioning of victims, and particular types of violence were becoming more sophisticated and psychologically meaningful. Richard's methodology for avoiding police detection was characterized by what experts call law enforcement evasion with pattern disruption. He systematically studied police investigation techniques and deliberately varied his methods to avoid creating patterns that investigators could use to predict his next move. His development of escape routes and safe houses revealed what forensic psychologists call predatory infrastructure with operational security. Richard was building a comprehensive support system for his criminal activities, treating his crimes like a professional operation rather than random violence. The psychological significance of Richard's evolving relationship with his victims was characterized by what experts call psychological possession with identity absorption. He wasn't just attacking people, he was systematically studying their personalities, stealing their identities, and incorporating aspects of their lives into his own psychological makeup. Richard's methodology for psychological torture evolved into what forensic psychologists call systematic terror with measured escalation. He developed techniques for gradually increasing his victims' fear and suffering, learning to read their psychological breaking points and manipulate their emotional responses. His approach to sexual violence revealed what experts call sadistic methodology with fantasy fulfillment. Richard's attacks weren't just about physical gratification. They were about implementing increasingly complex psychological and sexual fantasies that required sophisticated planning and execution. The psychological analysis of Richard's victim interaction patterns reveals what forensic psychologists call predatory communication with psychological manipulation. He developed specific techniques for talking to his victims, learning which approaches would maximize their compliance and which would increase their terror. Richard's methodology for post-crime behavior was characterized by what experts call psychological integration with experience processing. After each attack, he would systematically review what had happened, analyzing his own performance and planning improvements for future crimes. His development of ritualistic behaviors at crime scenes revealed what forensic psychologists call symbolic methodology with spiritual integration. The satanic symbols and specific crime scene arrangements weren't random. They were becoming increasingly important to his psychological satisfaction and sense of identity. The psychological significance of Richard's evolving killing techniques was characterized by what experts call homicide refinement with efficiency optimization. He was learning the most effective methods for killing different types of victims while minimizing his own physical effort and psychological stress. Richard's methodology for selecting and entering homes evolved into what forensic psychologists call residential vulnerability exploitation with systematic penetration. He developed sophisticated techniques for identifying which homes would be easiest to enter and which would provide the best opportunities for his preferred criminal activities. His approach to managing victim resistance revealed what experts call opposition neutralization with psychological dominance. Richard developed specific techniques for dealing with victims who fought back, learning to use their resistance as an opportunity to demonstrate his superior power and control. The psychological analysis of Richard's weapon evolution shows what forensic psychologists call tool sophistication with psychological enhancement. His weapons weren't just becoming more effective. They were becoming more psychologically meaningful to him and more terrifying to his victims. Richard's methodology for psychological terror maximization was characterized by what experts call fear amplification with systematic intimidation. He developed techniques for creating the maximum possible psychological impact on his victims while ensuring their complete compliance with his demands. His development of signature verbal patterns revealed what forensic psychologists call linguistic terror with psychological programming. Richard's specific phrases and communication style were becoming more sophisticated and psychologically devastating to his victims. The psychological significance of Richard's evolving crime scene staging was characterized by what experts call environmental manipulation with psychological theater. He was learning to arrange crime scenes in ways that would maximize the psychological impact on both victims and investigators. Richard's methodology for victim selection had evolved into what forensic psychologists call predatory targeting with systematic vulnerability assessment. He could identify potential victims, evaluate their weaknesses, and plan attacks with remarkable efficiency and psychological sophistication. His approach to managing multiple crime scenes revealed what experts call operational complexity with systematic organization. Richard was developing the ability to maintain multiple criminal operations simultaneously while avoiding detection and maintaining psychological control over all aspects of his predatory behavior. The psychological analysis of Richard's methodology development reveals what forensic psychologists call criminal evolution with systematic refinement. His techniques were becoming more sophisticated, more psychologically complex, and more terrifyingly effective with each crime he committed. By 1984, Richard had developed what experts call comprehensive predatory methodology with optimal psychological integration. His criminal techniques had evolved from chaotic violence into a systematic approach to predation that would make him one of the most feared serial killers in American history. You're now entering the most disturbing aspect of Richard Ramirez's criminal psychology, his systematic approach to victim selection and psychological targeting. This reveals how predators think about and evaluate potential victims before striking. Richard's victim selection process was characterized by what forensic psychologists call systematic vulnerability assessment with predatory optimization. He didn't choose victims randomly. Every target was carefully evaluated based on multiple psychological and physical factors that would maximize his chances of success. His primary selection criterion was what experts call isolation identification with resistance evaluation. Richard looked for people who were alone, vulnerable, and unlikely to fight back effectively. He studied their living situations, their physical capabilities, and their psychological profiles before making his decision. The psychological significance of Richard's age-diverse victim selection reveals what forensic psychologists call demographic experimentation with psychological variety. He deliberately targeted victims across different age groups to test how different people would respond to his attacks and to satisfy different aspects of his complex psychological needs. Richard's methodology for studying potential victims was characterized by what experts call surveillance psychology with behavioral analysis. He would spend days or weeks watching people, learning their routines, identifying their vulnerabilities, and timing his attacks for maximum psychological impact. His selection of elderly victims revealed what forensic psychologists call vulnerability exploitation with power demonstration. Richard understood that older people were physically weaker, more easily intimidated, and less likely to resist effectively. Their vulnerability provided him with psychological satisfaction and practical advantages. The psychological analysis of Richard's targeting of young victims shows what experts call innocence, corruption with psychological contamination. He was particularly drawn to victims who represented purity or normalcy, and destroying their sense of safety provided him with intense psychological gratification. Richard's victim selection based on living situations was characterized by what forensic psychologists call residential vulnerability with isolation preference. He specifically looked for people who lived alone, had poor security, or were in situations where help would be unlikely to arrive quickly. His methodology for evaluating victim resistance potential reveals what experts call opposition assessment with control planning. Richard studied how different types of people might fight back, and he chose victims who were least likely to pose a serious threat to his physical safety or psychological dominance. The psychological significance of Richard's selection of female victims was characterized by what experts call gender targeting with domination psychology. Women represented both physical vulnerability and psychological satisfaction for Richard, allowing him to demonstrate his power while fulfilling his violent sexual fantasies. Richard's approach to targeting couples revealed what forensic psychologists call relationship dynamics exploitation with psychological manipulation. He understood that people in relationships could be controlled through threats to their partners, and he used this knowledge to maximize his psychological control over multiple victims. His selection of victims based on their perceived social status was characterized by what experts call class targeting with psychological leveling. Richard took particular satisfaction in victimizing people who appeared to have comfortable or privileged lives, using his attacks to demonstrate that no one was safe from his power. The psychological analysis of Richard's victim age preferences reveals what forensic psychologists call generational targeting with psychological experimentation. He was interested in how different age groups would respond to his attacks, and he adjusted his methods based on the psychological profiles of his intended victims. Richard's methodology for identifying victim schedules and routines was characterized by what experts call behavioral pattern recognition with timing optimization. He studied when people were most vulnerable, when they were alone, and when their psychological defenses would be at their lowest. His selection of victims based on their physical characteristics revealed what forensic psychologists call aesthetic targeting with psychological projection. Richard's victim choices often reflected his own psychological needs and sexual fantasies, and he selected people who fit specific physical profiles that satisfied his complex psychological requirements. The psychological significance of Richard's targeting of religious victims was characterized by what experts call spiritual violation with sacrilege satisfaction. He took particular pleasure in attacking people who represented moral or spiritual values, using his crimes to demonstrate his rejection of conventional morality. Richard's approach to victim psychological profiling was characterized by what experts call personality assessment with manipulation planning. He studied his potential victims' psychological characteristics, identifying those who would be most easily intimidated and controlled during his attacks. His methodology for evaluating victim security measures reveals what forensic psychologists call protection assessment with penetration planning. Richard systematically studied how different people protected themselves, and he chose victims whose security measures he could easily overcome. The psychological analysis of Richard's victim location preferences shows what experts call geographic targeting with territorial psychology. He selected victims in areas where he felt psychologically comfortable and operationally secure, often returning to neighborhoods where he had previously been successful. Richard's selection of victims based on their social connections was characterized by what forensic psychologists call isolation targeting with help prevention. He specifically looked for people who were socially isolated or whose absence wouldn't be noticed quickly, giving him more time to complete his attacks. His approach to targeting victims with specific psychological vulnerabilities reveals what experts call trauma exploitation with psychological amplification. Richard could identify people who had existing psychological problems or traumas, and he used this knowledge to maximize the psychological impact of his attacks. The psychological significance of Richard's selection of sleeping victims was characterized by what experts call unconscious targeting with vulnerability maximization. He understood that people were most psychologically vulnerable when they were asleep, and he used this knowledge to maximize the terror and shock of his attacks. Richard's methodology for victim approach and initial contact was characterized by what forensic psychologists call psychological ambush with terror initiation. He developed specific techniques for appearing suddenly in his victims' lives and immediately establishing psychological dominance through fear and intimidation. His selection of victims based on their perceived innocence reveals what experts call purity targeting with corruption psychology. Richard was particularly drawn to victims who represented normalcy or goodness, and destroying their sense of safety and security provided him with intense psychological satisfaction. The psychological analysis of Richard's victim interaction patterns shows what forensic psychologists call predatory communication with psychological manipulation. He developed specific techniques for talking to his victims, learning which approaches would maximize their compliance and increase their terror. Richard's approach to managing victim resistance was characterized by what experts call opposition neutralization with psychological dominance escalation. He had developed techniques for dealing with victims who fought back, using their resistance as an opportunity to demonstrate his superior power and control. His selection of victims based on their living arrangements reveals what forensic psychologists call domestic targeting with privacy exploitation. Richard specifically looked for living situations that would provide him with privacy and time to complete his attacks without interruption. The psychological significance of Richard's victim selection criteria was characterized by what experts call comprehensive targeting with psychological optimization. Every aspect of his victim selection was designed to maximize his psychological satisfaction while minimizing his risk of capture or serious resistance. Richard's methodology for victim psychological assessment had evolved into what forensic psychologists call predatory profiling. With systematic evaluation, he could quickly assess potential victims' psychological and physical vulnerabilities, making his selection process both efficient and devastatingly effective. His approach to victim selection revealed what experts call hunter psychology with systematic predation. Richard wasn't just choosing victims randomly. He was systematically hunting human prey, using sophisticated psychological techniques to identify and target the most vulnerable members of society. The psychological analysis of Richard's victim selection process reveals what forensic psychologists call predatory psychology with systematic vulnerability exploitation. His methods were becoming increasingly sophisticated and psychologically complex, making him one of the most effective and terrifying predators in criminal history. You're now examining Richard Ramirez at the height of his criminal activity, the period from 1984 to 1985 when his psychological state reached its most dangerous and unstable peak. This is where we analyze the mind of a predator operating at maximum psychological intensity. Richard's psychological state during his peak killing period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call predatory optimization with reality detachment. His mind had reached a perfect balance between criminal effectiveness and complete disconnection from normal human emotion and morality. His daily psychological routine during this period reveals what experts call violence dependency with escalation compulsion. Richard wasn't just choosing to kill. His psychology had become addicted to violence, requiring increasingly extreme stimulation to achieve the same psychological satisfaction he had previously gained from lesser crimes. The psychological analysis of Richard's mental state during attacks shows what forensic psychologists call dissociative predation with emotional numbing. He could commit the most brutal acts of violence while maintaining complete emotional detachment, as if he were watching someone else commit the crimes. Richard's relationship with his own identity during this period was characterized by what experts call personality fragmentation with predatory integration. He had multiple psychological personas: the charming manipulator, the brutal killer, the satanic devotee, all operating simultaneously within his fractured mind. His psychological response to media coverage of his crimes reveals what forensic psychologists call notoriety, intoxication with legend construction. The fear and attention his crimes generated wasn't just satisfying his ego. It was becoming an essential part of his psychological motivation to continue and escalate his criminal behavior. The psychological significance of Richard's increased drug use during this period was characterized by what experts call chemical amplification with reality dissolution. Cocaine and PCP weren't just enhancing his criminal behavior. They were dissolving the remaining barriers between his violent fantasies and his willingness to act on them. Richard's sleep patterns during his peak period reveal what forensic psychologists call nocturnal optimization with predatory circadian adaptation. His body and mind had completely adapted to nighttime activity, with his psychological energy and criminal motivation reaching their highest levels during the dark hours. His psychological state during home invasions was characterized by what experts call territorial invasion with psychological possession. Richard wasn't just entering homes to commit crimes. He was psychologically claiming these spaces as his own, treating the residents as trespassers in their own lives. The psychological analysis of Richard's victim interaction during this period shows what forensic psychologists call predatory communication with psychological domination. He had developed sophisticated techniques for establishing immediate psychological control over his victims through specific verbal patterns and intimidation tactics. Richard's relationship with violence during his peak period was characterized by what experts call brutality normalization with satisfaction escalation. Violence had become his normal mode of interaction with the world, and he required increasingly extreme acts to achieve the same psychological gratification. His psychological response to victim resistance reveals what forensic psychologists call opposition utilization with dominance amplification. Richard had learned to use his victims' attempts to fight back as opportunities to demonstrate his superior power and to increase his own psychological satisfaction. The psychological significance of Richard's satanic practices during this period was characterized by what experts call spiritual inversion with evil empowerment. His occult beliefs weren't just philosophical choices. They were providing him with psychological justification for his increasingly extreme behavior. Richard's mental state during his killing spree was characterized by what forensic psychologists call homicidal automation with psychological efficiency. He could commit murder with the same emotional detachment that most people use to perform routine tasks, treating human life as completely disposable. His psychological approach to crime scene manipulation reveals what experts call environmental control with psychological theater. Richard was arranging crime scenes not just to avoid detection, but to create maximum psychological impact on both victims and investigators. The psychological analysis of Richard's emotional state during this period shows what forensic psychologists call affective flattening with violence sensitivity. He had lost the ability to feel normal human emotions while becoming hypersensitive to opportunities for violence and control. Richard's relationship with his own mortality during his peak period was characterized by what experts call death fascination with invincibility delusion. He was simultaneously obsessed with death and convinced that he was somehow immune to the consequences of his actions. His psychological state during victim selection was characterized by what forensic psychologists call predatory assessment. With systematic evaluation, Richard could instantly analyze potential victims' vulnerabilities and determine their suitability for his specific psychological and criminal needs. The psychological significance of Richard's increasing boldness during this period reveals what experts call risk tolerance escalation with overconfidence development. His success at avoiding capture was creating a dangerous psychological state where he believed he was untouchable. Richard's mental approach to law enforcement during his peak period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call authority defiance with tactical superiority. He viewed police not as a threat but as opponents in a game where he held all the advantages. His psychological state during sexual violence was characterized by what experts call sadistic integration with power demonstration. Sexual assault wasn't just about gratification. It was about demonstrating his complete control over another person's body, mind, and dignity. The psychological analysis of Richard's fantasy life during this period shows what forensic psychologists call reality contamination with behavioral rehearsal. His violent fantasies had become so detailed and consuming that they were indistinguishable from his actual criminal experiences. Richard's relationship with his victim's fear during his peak period was characterized by what experts call terror consumption with psychological feeding. He wasn't just enjoying his victim's fear, he was psychologically consuming it, using their terror as a source of energy and validation. His psychological state during post-crime periods reveals what forensic psychologists call satisfaction processing with escalation planning. After each attack, Richard would systematically review his performance and plan improvements for future crimes, treating murder like a skill to be perfected. The psychological significance of Richard's increasing ritualistic behavior was characterized by what experts call ceremonial violence with spiritual integration. His crimes were becoming increasingly elaborate ceremonies that satisfied both his psychological needs and his twisted spiritual beliefs. Richard's mental state during his peak period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call optimal predatory functionality with psychological synchronization. All aspects of his personality, skills, and motivations had aligned to create a perfectly efficient killing machine. His psychological response to his own actions during this period reveals what experts call moral detachment with behavioral justification. Richard had developed elaborate psychological mechanisms for viewing his crimes not as evil acts, but as natural expressions of his superior nature. The psychological analysis of Richard's peak period shows what forensic psychologists call criminal culmination. With psychological optimization, he had reached the highest level of predatory effectiveness that his damaged psychology could achieve. Richard's psychological state during his most intense killing period was characterized by what experts call violence saturation with escalation, desperation. He was committing crimes with increasing frequency and brutality, but his psychological satisfaction was actually decreasing, requiring ever more extreme acts. His mental approach to his own criminal legacy during this period reveals what forensic psychologists call legend construction with immortality seeking. Richard was consciously trying to create a criminal reputation that would outlive his physical existence. The psychological significance of Richard's peak period was characterized by what experts call predatory apex with psychological unsustainability. He had reached the maximum level of criminal intensity that his psychology could maintain, setting the stage for the eventual breakdown that would lead to his capture. You're now examining how Richard Ramirez maintained his double life and avoided detection while committing some of the most brutal crimes in American history. This reveals the psychological mechanisms that allowed him to operate as both a functioning member of society and a predator. Richard's primary control mechanism was what forensic psychologists call compartmentalization mastery with identity segmentation. He had developed the ability to completely separate his criminal persona from his public identity, allowing him to interact normally with people while planning their deaths. His psychological approach to maintaining normal social relationships was characterized by what experts call surface functionality with emotional mimicry. Richard could simulate normal human emotions and social responses while feeling nothing, creating the appearance of normalcy that protected his criminal activities. The psychological significance of Richard's employment during his criminal period reveals what forensic psychologists call legitimacy maintenance with operational camouflage. His various jobs weren't just sources of income. They were psychological cover that allowed him to blend into normal society while planning his attacks. Richard's methodology for managing his criminal schedule was characterized by what experts call temporal compartmentalization with routine optimization. He had developed sophisticated systems for balancing his normal daily activities with his criminal operations, ensuring that neither interfered with the other. His psychological approach to law enforcement interaction reveals what forensic psychologists call authority manipulation with suspicion deflection. Richard had learned to interact with police in ways that would minimize suspicion while gathering information about their investigation techniques and procedures. The psychological analysis of Richard's social behavior during this period shows what experts call behavioral camouflage with personality projection. He could present different versions of himself to different people, tailoring his personality to match what each person expected or wanted to see. Richard's control of his physical appearance was characterized by what forensic psychologists call image management with recognition prevention. He systematically altered his appearance between crimes, using clothing, grooming, and behavioral changes to avoid being identified by witnesses or security cameras. His psychological approach to managing criminal evidence reveals what experts call operational security with forensic awareness. Richard had developed sophisticated methods for disposing of evidence, cleaning crime scenes, and avoiding leaving physical traces that could connect him to his crimes. The psychological significance of Richard's drug use patterns during this period was characterized by what experts call chemical regulation with performance optimization. He wasn't just using drugs recreationally. He was using them strategically to enhance his criminal performance while maintaining his ability to function normally in society. Richard's methodology for managing his criminal territory was characterized by what forensic psychologists call geographic control with operational dispersion. He systematically varied his crime locations to avoid creating patterns while maintaining psychological familiarity with his hunting grounds. His psychological approach to victim intimidation reveals what experts call terror management with compliance assurance. Richard had developed specific techniques for ensuring that his victims would be too frightened or traumatized to provide accurate descriptions to police. The psychological analysis of Richard's media consumption patterns shows what forensic psychologists call intelligence gathering with ego gratification. He obsessively followed news coverage of his crimes, using media reports to assess police progress while feeding his psychological need for recognition and fear. Richard's control of his criminal communications was characterized by what experts call information security with operational isolation. He avoided discussing his crimes with anyone, maintaining complete psychological isolation about his criminal activities, even from people he trusted. His psychological approach to managing criminal stress reveals what forensic psychologists call pressure regulation with psychological maintenance. Richard had developed techniques for managing the psychological stress of his double life, preventing mental breakdown while maintaining his criminal effectiveness. The psychological significance of Richard's sleep management during this period was characterized by what experts call circadian manipulation with energy optimization. He had learned to control his sleep patterns to maximize his criminal energy during nighttime hours while maintaining daytime functionality. Richard's methodology for managing his criminal finances was characterized by what forensic psychologists call resource control with lifestyle maintenance. He had developed systems for converting stolen goods into usable income while maintaining the appearance of legitimate financial resources. His psychological approach to managing relationships with women reveals what experts call emotional manipulation with operational security. Richard used romantic relationships not just for personal satisfaction, but as psychological cover for his criminal activities. The psychological analysis of Richard's family interactions during this period shows what forensic psychologists call kinship management with suspicion prevention. He maintained relationships with family members while carefully controlling their access to information about his activities and psychological state. Richard's control of his criminal impulses in public settings was characterized by what experts call behavioral regulation with social camouflage. He could suppress his violent tendencies in situations where they might expose his true nature, waiting for appropriate opportunities to express them. His psychological approach to managing criminal equipment reveals what forensic psychologists call tool security with operational readiness. Richard had developed systems for acquiring, maintaining, and disposing of weapons and criminal tools while avoiding detection. The psychological significance of Richard's transportation methods was characterized by what experts call mobility control with tracking prevention. He systematically varied his transportation methods to avoid creating patterns that police could use to predict his movements or identify him. Richard's methodology for managing his criminal intelligence was characterized by what forensic psychologists call information processing with strategic planning. He systematically gathered information about potential victims, police procedures, and security measures, using this intelligence to optimize his criminal operations. His psychological approach to managing his criminal reputation reveals what experts call notoriety control with fear amplification. Richard carefully managed how his crimes were perceived by the public, ensuring that his reputation would maximize terror while minimizing useful information for investigators. The psychological analysis of Richard's emotional regulation during this period shows what forensic psychologists call effective control with functional maintenance. He had developed sophisticated techniques for managing his emotions to prevent psychological breakdown while maintaining his criminal effectiveness. Richard's control of his criminal documentation was characterized by what experts call memory management with operational security. He avoided keeping any records of his crimes while maintaining detailed psychological memories that he could use to relive and plan future attacks. His psychological approach to managing criminal witnesses reveals what forensic psychologists call testimony control with intimidation maintenance. Richard used specific techniques to ensure that surviving victims would be too traumatized or frightened to provide useful information to investigators. The psychological significance of Richard's legal knowledge during this period was characterized by what experts call procedural awareness with countermeasure development. He had studied law enforcement procedures and legal processes, using this knowledge to avoid behaviors that might provide evidence for prosecutors. Richard's methodology for managing his criminal evolution was characterized by what forensic psychologists call skill development with adaptation optimization. He continuously refined his criminal techniques based on experience while maintaining operational security and psychological stability. His psychological approach to managing his criminal legacy reveals what experts call reputation construction with immortality planning. Richard was consciously building a criminal reputation that would outlive his physical existence while maintaining operational effectiveness. The psychological analysis of Richard's control mechanisms reveals what forensic psychologists call comprehensive operational security with psychological sustainability. He had developed sophisticated systems for maintaining his criminal activities while avoiding detection, creating one of the most effective predatory operations in criminal history. You're now examining the psychological factors that drove Richard Ramirez's behavior to become increasingly extreme and the mounting pressures that began to crack his carefully constructed criminal facade. This is where we analyze the beginning of his psychological unraveling. Richard's escalation pattern was characterized by what forensic psychologists call violence tolerance with satisfaction diminishment. Each crime provided less psychological satisfaction than the previous one, forcing him to commit increasingly extreme acts to achieve the same emotional high that earlier crimes had provided. His psychological response to this diminishing satisfaction was characterized by what experts call stimulation seeking with boundary elimination. Richard began removing all limits on his criminal behavior, attempting increasingly brutal and risky acts in his desperate pursuit of the psychological satisfaction that was becoming harder to achieve. The psychological analysis of Richard's increasing frequency of attacks reveals what forensic psychologists call compulsion acceleration with controlled deterioration. He wasn't just choosing to commit more crimes. His psychology had become addicted to violence, and the addiction was requiring increasingly frequent doses to maintain his psychological equilibrium. Richard's relationship with his own criminal reputation during this period was characterized by what experts call legend pressure with performance anxiety. The media attention and public fear he had generated were creating psychological pressure to live up to his terrifying reputation, driving him to commit even more extreme acts. His psychological state during this escalation period reveals what forensic psychologists call identity fusion with criminal persona. Richard's normal personality was becoming completely absorbed by his criminal identity, leaving no psychological space for anything other than predatory behavior and violent fantasy. The psychological significance of Richard's increasing drug use during this period was characterized by what experts call chemical dependency with reality escape. Cocaine and PCP weren't just enhancing his criminal behavior anymore. They were becoming necessary for him to function at all, both in his criminal activities and in his attempts to maintain normal social interactions. Richard's sleep patterns during this escalation period reveal what forensic psychologists call circadian disruption with psychological destabilization. His completely nocturnal lifestyle was creating additional psychological stress, contributing to his increasing mental instability and poor decision-making. His psychological approach to victim selection during this period was characterized by what experts call target desperation with risk tolerance escalation. Richard was choosing increasingly risky victims and crime locations, driven by his need for more extreme stimulation rather than strategic criminal planning. The psychological analysis of Richard's crime scene behavior during this period shows what forensic psychologists call ritualistic intensification with symbolic desperation. His satanic practices and crime scene arrangements were becoming more elaborate and time-consuming, reflecting his increasing psychological need for meaning and control. Richard's relationship with law enforcement during this escalation period was characterized by what experts call authority taunting with capture temptation. He was beginning to take unnecessary risks and leave more obvious clues, suggesting a subconscious desire to be caught and stopped. His psychological response to near-capture incidents reveals what forensic psychologists call danger addiction with invincibility delusion. Each close call with police was providing Richard with additional psychological stimulation, reinforcing his belief that he was somehow invincible and untouchable. The psychological significance of Richard's increasing violence toward victims was characterized by what experts call brutality escalation with empathy extinction. His attacks were becoming increasingly savage and prolonged, reflecting his complete loss of any remaining human empathy or restraint. Richard's methodology for managing his criminal stress during this period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call pressure response with behavioral acceleration. Instead of reducing his criminal activity to manage stress, he was increasing it, using more crimes as a way to cope with the psychological pressure of his lifestyle. His psychological state during victim interactions was characterized by what experts call predatory desperation with control obsession. Richard was spending more time with his victims, engaging in increasingly elaborate torture and psychological manipulation as he sought deeper levels of satisfaction from his attacks. The psychological analysis of Richard's decision-making during this period shows what forensic psychologists call judgment deterioration. With impulse dominance, his ability to make strategic criminal decisions was declining, replaced by increasingly impulsive and risky behavior driven by his psychological needs. Richard's relationship with his own mortality during this escalation period was characterized by what experts call death fascination with self-destruction drive. He was becoming increasingly reckless with his own safety, suggesting a subconscious desire for the ultimate thrill of risking his own death. His psychological approach to managing his criminal territory reveals what forensic psychologists call geographic desperation with pattern abandonment. Richard was abandoning his careful geographic strategies, returning to previous crime locations and creating patterns that would make him easier for police to track. The psychological significance of Richard's increasing paranoia during this period was characterized by what experts call surveillance anxiety with reality distortion. He was becoming convinced that he was being watched and followed, creating additional psychological stress that was affecting his judgment and behavior. Richard's methodology for managing his criminal equipment during this period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call tool obsession with fetishistic attachment. His weapons and criminal tools were becoming psychologically important to him beyond their practical utility, reflecting his increasing mental instability. His psychological state during post-crime periods reveals what forensic psychologists call satisfaction deficit with compulsion intensification. Richard was experiencing less psychological satisfaction from his crimes while simultaneously feeling more compelled to commit them, creating a dangerous cycle of escalating violence. The psychological analysis of Richard's media consumption during this period shows what experts call attention dependency with validation seeking. He was becoming increasingly dependent on media coverage of his crimes for psychological validation, driving him to commit more spectacular and attention-grabbing acts. Richard's relationship with his drug suppliers during this escalation period was characterized by what experts call chemical dependency with criminal exposure. His increasing drug needs were creating additional criminal connections and exposing him to more potential witnesses and informants. His psychological approach to managing his criminal finances reveals what forensic psychologists call resource desperation with theft escalation. Richard was stealing more frequently and taking greater risks to support his drug habit and criminal lifestyle, creating additional opportunities for police to track him. The psychological significance of Richard's increasing isolation during this period was characterized by what experts call social withdrawal with reality detachment. He was cutting ties with normal social connections, leaving him completely immersed in his criminal world with no moderating influences. Richard's methodology for managing his criminal communications during this period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call security breakdown with exposure risk. His increasing paranoia and drug use were affecting his ability to maintain operational security, creating vulnerabilities in his criminal operations. His psychological state during this escalation period reveals what experts call mental deterioration with criminal intensification. Richard's psychological stability was declining even as his criminal behavior was becoming more extreme, creating a dangerous combination that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The psychological analysis of Richard's pressure response patterns shows what forensic psychologists call stress amplification with behavioral acceleration. Instead of reducing his criminal activity in response to increasing pressure, he was escalating it, using more extreme crimes as a way to cope with psychological stress. Richard's relationship with his own criminal legacy during this period was characterized by what experts call reputation pressure with performance desperation. The fear and attention his crimes had generated were creating psychological pressure to maintain his terrifying reputation through increasingly extreme acts. His psychological approach to victim selection during this final escalation period reveals what forensic psychologists call target desperation. With boundary elimination, Richard was choosing victims based purely on opportunity and psychological need rather than strategic criminal planning, setting the stage for the mistakes that would lead to his capture. The psychological significance of Richard's escalation period was characterized by what experts call criminal culmination with psychological unsustainability. He had reached the maximum level of criminal intensity that his damaged psychology could maintain, creating the conditions for his inevitable breakdown and capture. You're now examining Richard Ramirez's psychological state during the massive police investigation that would eventually lead to his capture. This reveals how mounting law enforcement pressure affected his mental condition and decision-making processes. Richard's initial psychological response to the police investigation was characterized by what forensic psychologists call surveillance paranoia with tactical adaptation. He was aware that law enforcement was closing in, but rather than retreating, his psychology was treating the investigation as an exciting game of cat and mouse. His methodology for monitoring police progress was characterized by what experts call intelligence gathering with obsessive tracking. Richard consumed every piece of media coverage about the investigation, studying police statements and news reports to understand how close they were to identifying him. The psychological significance of Richard's reaction to his composite sketch release reveals what forensic psychologists call identity exposure with narcissistic validation. Seeing his face on television and in newspapers provided him with psychological satisfaction, confirming his importance and the fear he had generated in the public. Richard's behavioral adaptation to increase police presence was characterized by what experts call operational modification with risk escalation. Instead of reducing his criminal activity, he began varying his methods and locations more frequently, treating the investigation as a challenge to overcome rather than a threat to avoid. His psychological state during near-capture incidents was characterized by what forensic psychologists call danger intoxication with invincibility reinforcement. Each time he escaped police attention, his psychology interpreted it as confirmation of his superior intelligence and criminal abilities. The psychological analysis of Richard's response to witness descriptions reveals what experts call identification anxiety with appearance modification. He began altering his physical appearance more frequently, not just for operational security, but because the psychological pressure of being hunted was affecting his sense of identity. Richard's relationship with the media coverage of his crimes during the investigation was characterized by what forensic psychologists call attention dependency with legend construction. He was becoming psychologically dependent on media attention, and the massive investigation was providing him with the recognition he craved. His psychological approach to managing the investigation pressure reveals what experts call stress response with criminal intensification. Rather than reducing his criminal activity under pressure, Richard was committing crimes more frequently and with greater brutality, using violence as a way to cope with psychological stress. The psychological significance of Richard's territory expansion during the investigation was characterized by what experts call geographic desperation with pattern abandonment. He was abandoning his careful geographic strategies, expanding his hunting ground in ways that would make him easier for police to track. Richard's methodology for gathering intelligence about the investigation was characterized by what forensic psychologists call counter-surveillance with information addiction. He was obsessively monitoring police communications, witness statements, and media reports to stay ahead of the investigation. His psychological state during this period reveals what experts call investigative pressure with reality distortion. The constant threat of capture was creating additional psychological stress that was affecting his judgment and increasing his paranoia about being watched and followed. The psychological analysis of Richard's decision-making during the investigation shows what forensic psychologists call judgment deterioration with impulsive escalation. His ability to make strategic criminal decisions was declining under investigation pressure, replaced by increasingly impulsive and risky behavior. Richard's relationship with his criminal associates during the investigation was characterized by what experts call isolation intensification with trust deterioration. He was becoming increasingly paranoid about being betrayed, cutting ties with anyone who might potentially provide information to police. His psychological approach to evidence management during this period reveals what forensic psychologists call forensic paranoia with destruction compulsion. Richard was becoming obsessed with eliminating evidence, spending significant time and energy on activities that were drawing additional attention to his behavior. The psychological significance of Richard's increasing drug use during the investigation was characterized by what experts call chemical escape with performance impairment. He was using cocaine and PCP more heavily to manage investigation stress, but the drugs were impairing his judgment and criminal effectiveness. Richard's methodology for managing his daily routines during the investigation was characterized by what forensic psychologists call behavioral modification with paranoid adaptation. He was constantly changing his habits, routines, and living arrangements in response to his paranoia about police surveillance. His psychological state during victim interactions was characterized by what experts call predatory desperation with control obsession. The investigation pressure was making him spend more time with victims, engaging in increasingly elaborate torture and psychological manipulation as he sought deeper satisfaction from his attacks. The psychological analysis of Richard's sleep patterns during the investigation reveals what forensic psychologists call circadian disruption with stress amplification. His already nocturnal lifestyle was becoming even more chaotic, contributing to his increasing mental instability and poor decision-making. Richard's relationship with his own criminal reputation during the investigation was characterized by what experts call legend pressure with performance anxiety. The massive media attention and public fear were creating psychological pressure to live up to his terrifying reputation. His psychological approach to managing investigation stress reveals what forensic psychologists call pressure response with behavioral acceleration. Instead of reducing his criminal activity to avoid capture, he was increasing it, using more crimes as a way to cope with the psychological pressure of being hunted. The psychological significance of Richard's increasing risk-taking during the investigation was characterized by what experts call danger addiction with capture temptation. He was taking unnecessary risks and leaving more obvious clues, suggesting a subconscious desire to be caught and stopped. Richard's methodology for counter-surveillance during this period was characterized by what forensic psychologists call detection avoidance with paranoid escalation. He was spending increasing amounts of time and energy on activities designed to avoid police detection, creating additional stress and behavioral patterns. His psychological state during crime scene management reveals what experts call forensic anxiety with ritualistic compensation. The investigation pressure was making him spend more time at crime scenes, engaging in increasingly elaborate rituals to maintain his psychological equilibrium. The psychological analysis of Richard's communication patterns during the investigation shows what forensic psychologists call social withdrawal with isolation intensification. He was cutting ties with normal social connections, leaving him completely immersed in his criminal world with no moderating influences. Richard's relationship with his drug suppliers during the investigation was characterized by what experts call chemical dependency with criminal exposure. His increasing drug needs were creating additional criminal connections and exposing him to more potential witnesses and informants. His psychological approach to managing his criminal finances during this period reveals what forensic psychologists call resource desperation with theft escalation. The investigation pressure was making him steal more frequently and take greater risks to support his drug habit and criminal lifestyle. The psychological significance of Richard's territorial behavior during the investigation was characterized by what experts call geographic paranoia with operational chaos. He was abandoning his systematic approach to crime location selection, making decisions based on paranoia and desperation rather than strategic planning. Richard's methodology for managing his criminal equipment during the investigation was characterized by what forensic psychologists call tool obsession with fetishistic attachment. His weapons and criminal tools were becoming psychologically important to him beyond their practical utility, reflecting his increasing mental instability. His psychological state during post-crime periods reveals what forensic psychologists call satisfaction deficit with compulsion intensification. The investigation pressure was reducing his psychological satisfaction from crimes while simultaneously increasing his compulsion to commit them. The psychological analysis of Richard's investigation period shows what forensic psychologists call pressure response with criminal intensification. Instead of reducing his criminal activity in response to increasing investigation pressure, he was escalating it, creating the conditions for his inevitable capture. You're now examining the psychological factors that led to Richard Ramirez's capture and his mental state during the moments when his criminal career came to an end. This reveals how even the most sophisticated criminal minds eventually break under pressure. Richard's psychological state in the days leading up to his capture was characterized by what forensic psychologists call operational exhaustion with reality fragmentation. The constant stress of being hunted was creating severe psychological strain that was affecting his ability to think clearly and make strategic decisions. His decision to travel to Arizona in August 1985 was characterized by what experts call geographic desperation with escape fantasy. Richard's psychology was seeking relief from the investigation pressure, but his judgment was so impaired that he was making decisions that would actually increase his risk of capture. The psychological significance of Richard's behavior during his Arizona trip reveals what forensic psychologists call identity confusion with criminal decompensation. He was alternating between his normal social persona and his criminal identity so rapidly that he was losing the ability to maintain either one effectively. Richard's psychological response to his photograph being published in newspapers was characterized by what experts call exposure panic with paranoid acceleration. Seeing his face widely distributed created intense psychological pressure that pushed him into increasingly desperate and poorly planned actions. His decision to return to Los Angeles despite the massive manhunt was characterized by what forensic psychologists call territorial compulsion with rational override. His psychology was driven by a need to return to familiar territory that overrode his rational understanding of the extreme danger he was facing. The psychological analysis of Richard's final criminal acts reveals what experts call desperation, escalation with abandon, recklessness. His last crimes were characterized by unusual sloppiness and risk-taking that suggested his psychological control systems were breaking down under extreme pressure. Richard's mental state during his attempted car theft on August 31, 1985, was characterized by what forensic psychologists call impulsive desperation with judgment collapse. He was making decisions based purely on immediate need rather than strategic thinking, suggesting severe psychological deterioration. His psychological response to being recognized by citizens in East Los Angeles reveals what experts call identity exposure with reality shock. The moment when strangers began identifying him as the Night Stalker created a psychological crisis that shattered his carefully constructed sense of invincibility. The psychological significance of Richard's attempt to escape on foot was characterized by what forensic psychologists call primal flight with cognitive regression. His sophisticated criminal mind was reduced to basic survival instincts, suggesting complete psychological breakdown under extreme stress. Richard's mental state during the citizen pursuit was characterized by what experts call predator reversal with victim psychology. For the first time in his criminal career, he was experiencing the terror and helplessness that he had inflicted on others, creating a profound psychological shock. His psychological response to being surrounded by angry citizens reveals what forensic psychologists call authority transfer with power inversion. The same community that had feared him was now controlling him, creating a psychological reality that was completely opposite to his criminal worldview. The psychological analysis of Richard's surrender to police shows what experts call protection seeking with role reversal. He was actively seeking police protection from the same citizens he had terrorized, demonstrating how completely his psychological reality had been shattered. Richard's mental state during his arrest was characterized by what forensic psychologists call identity collapse with psychological fragmentation. The Night Stalker persona that had dominated his psychology was disintegrating, leaving him psychologically naked and vulnerable. His psychological response to being handcuffed and read his rights reveals what experts call power termination with reality acceptance. The physical restraints and legal procedures were forcing him to confront the end of his criminal career and the collapse of his carefully constructed identity. The psychological significance of Richard's initial police interviews was characterized by what forensic psychologists call defensive withdrawal with identity protection. He was attempting to maintain some psychological control by refusing to cooperate, but his overall demeanor suggested profound psychological exhaustion. Richard's mental state during his booking and processing reveals what experts call institutional adaptation with identity confusion. He was beginning to adapt to the reality of being a prisoner rather than a predator, but his psychology was struggling to integrate this new reality. His psychological response to media coverage of his capture was characterized by what forensic psychologists call notoriety validation with powerlessness recognition. While he still craved the attention, he was beginning to understand that his criminal career was over. The psychological analysis of Richard's jail behavior immediately after capture shows what experts call environmental adaptation with control seeking. He was attempting to establish some form of psychological control in his new environment, but his methods were limited and largely ineffective. Richard's mental state during his first court appearances was characterized by what forensic psychologists call public performance with identity maintenance. He was still attempting to project the Night Stalker persona, but his psychological resources were severely depleted. His psychological response to the evidence presented against him reveals what experts call reality confrontation with denial mechanisms. He was being forced to confront the full extent of his crimes, but his psychology was still attempting to maintain some form of psychological protection. The psychological significance of Richard's legal strategy discussions was characterized by what forensic psychologists call survival adaptation with identity preservation. He was beginning to focus on legal survival rather than criminal activity, but he was still attempting to maintain his criminal identity. Richard's mental state during victim impact statements reveals what experts call empathy absence with psychological detachment. Even when confronted with the suffering he had caused, his psychology remained largely unaffected, demonstrating the complete destruction of his capacity for human empathy. His psychological response to his celebrity status in jail was characterized by what forensic psychologists call notoriety adaptation with power substitution. He was using his criminal fame as a substitute for the power he had lost through capture. but it provided only minimal psychological satisfaction. The psychological analysis of Richard's correspondence with admirers shows what experts call validation seeking with identity reinforcement. He was using letters from fans to maintain his criminal identity and psychological sense of importance in his new powerless situation. Richard's mental state during plea negotiations reveals what forensic psychologists call strategic adaptation with reality acceptance. He was beginning to understand that his criminal career was over and that he needed to focus on legal survival rather than criminal activity. His psychological response to the death penalty proceedings was characterized by what experts call mortality confrontation with defiance, maintenance. He was being forced to confront his own death, but his psychology was still attempting to maintain some form of control and defiance. The psychological significance of Richard's final statements during sentencing was characterized by what forensic psychologists call legacy construction with identity preservation. He was attempting to maintain his criminal reputation and psychological identity even as he faced the ultimate consequences of his actions. Richard's mental state during his transfer to death row reveals what experts call environmental adaptation with identity maintenance. He was adapting to his new reality as a condemned prisoner while still attempting to maintain the psychological identity that had driven his criminal behavior. His psychological response to the appeals process was characterized by what forensic psychologists call hope maintenance with reality denial. He was clinging to legal possibilities while his psychology continued to struggle with the reality of his situation. The psychological analysis of Richard's capture and breakdown reveals what experts call criminal termination with psychological fragmentation. His carefully constructed criminal identity had been completely shattered, leaving him psychologically adrift and struggling to adapt to a reality he had never prepared for. You're now examining Richard Ramirez's psychological adaptation to the legal system and his mental state during the judicial proceedings. This reveals how criminal minds adjust to institutional control and confront the consequences of their actions. Richard's initial psychological response to the legal system was characterized by what forensic psychologists call institutional defiance with control rejection. He viewed the court proceedings not as legitimate justice, but as another form of oppression that he was psychologically compelled to resist. His methodology for managing his legal representation reveals what experts call authority manipulation with strategic cooperation. Richard was selective about when and how he cooperated with his attorneys, using compliance as a tool to maintain some psychological control over his situation. The psychological significance of Richard's courtroom behavior was characterized by what forensic psychologists call performance maintenance with identity preservation. He was using his court appearances as opportunities to maintain his criminal persona and demonstrate his continued psychological power. Richard's relationship with the media during his trial was characterized by what experts call attention manipulation with legacy construction. He understood that his trial was being broadcast to the world, and he was using this platform to reinforce his criminal reputation and maintain his psychological identity. His psychological response to victim testimony reveals what forensic psychologists call empathy absence with emotional detachment. Even when confronted with detailed accounts of the suffering he had caused, Richard's psychology remained largely unaffected, demonstrating his complete lack of remorse or human empathy. The psychological analysis of Richard's interaction with his legal team shows what experts call strategic cooperation with manipulation attempts. He was attempting to use his attorneys as tools to maintain his psychological control while navigating the legal system's demands. Richard's mental state during evidence presentation was characterized by what forensic psychologists call reality confrontation with denial mechanisms. He was being forced to confront the full extent of his crimes, but his psychology was still attempting to maintain some form of psychological protection. His psychological approach to cross-examination reveals what experts call defensive positioning with intellectual engagement. Richard was treating legal questioning as an intellectual challenge rather than a moral reckoning, demonstrating his continued psychological detachment from his crimes. The psychological significance of Richard's outbursts during trial was characterized by what forensic psychologists call control assertion with frustration expression. When he felt his psychological control slipping, he would attempt to reassert dominance through disruptive behavior and verbal aggression. Richard's relationship with the judge and court officers reveals what experts call authority testing with boundary exploration. He was constantly testing the limits of acceptable behavior, using minor acts of defiance to maintain his psychological sense of power. His psychological response to the prosecution's case was characterized by what forensic psychologists call adversarial engagement with intellectual stimulation. Richard was treating the legal proceedings as a mental competition rather than a moral judgment of his actions. The psychological analysis of Richard's decision-making during plea negotiations shows what experts call strategic calculation with survival prioritization. He was beginning to understand that his criminal career was over and that he needed to focus on legal survival rather than maintaining his criminal identity. Richard's mental state during jury selection reveals what forensic psychologists call audience evaluation with manipulation planning. He was studying potential jurors not as judges of his actions, but as potential targets for psychological manipulation. His psychological approach to his defense strategy was characterized by what experts call responsibility avoidance with victimization narrative. Richard was attempting to portray himself as a victim of circumstances rather than accepting responsibility for his criminal choices. The psychological significance of Richard's family testimony was characterized by what forensic psychologists call relationship exploitation with sympathy manipulation. He was using his family's suffering as a tool to generate sympathy rather than genuinely connecting with their pain. Richard's mental state during psychiatric evaluation reveals what experts call assessment manipulation with diagnosis avoidance. He was attempting to control the psychological evaluation process to avoid any diagnosis that might undermine his criminal identity. His psychological response to expert witness testimony was characterized by what forensic psychologists call scientific challenge with intellectual engagement. Richard was treating psychological and forensic testimony as intellectual puzzles rather than explanations of his criminal behavior. The psychological analysis of Richard's sentencing phase behavior shows what experts call outcome acceptance with defiance maintenance. He was beginning to understand that he would likely receive the death penalty, but his psychology was still attempting to maintain some form of control and defiance. Richard's relationship with his supporters during the trial was characterized by what forensic psychologists call validation seeking with identity reinforcement. He was using the attention from admirers to maintain his criminal identity and psychological sense of importance. His psychological response to victim impact statements reveals what experts call emotional immunity with psychological barrier maintenance. Even when confronted with the detailed suffering he had caused, Richard's psychology remained protected by his complete lack of empathy. The psychological significance of Richard's final statements during sentencing was characterized by what forensic psychologists call legacy construction with identity preservation. He was attempting to maintain his criminal reputation and psychological identity even as he faced the ultimate consequences. Richard's mental state during the death penalty phase reveals what experts call mortality confrontation with existential defiance. He was being forced to confront his own death, but his psychology was still attempting to maintain some form of control and superiority. His psychological response to the guilty verdict was characterized by what forensic psychologists call outcome acceptance with responsibility rejection. While he accepted the legal reality of his conviction, his psychology still refused to accept moral responsibility for his actions. The psychological analysis of Richard's appeals strategy shows what experts call hope maintenance with reality manipulation. He was using the appeals process not just for legal survival, but as a way to maintain his psychological sense of power and control. Richard's mental state during his transfer to death row reveals what forensic psychologists call environmental adaptation with identity maintenance. He was adapting to his new reality as a condemned prisoner while still attempting to maintain the psychological identity that had driven his criminal behavior. His psychological response to death row conditions was characterized by what experts call institutional adaptation with superiority maintenance. Even in prison, Richard was attempting to maintain his psychological sense of superiority over other inmates and correctional staff. The psychological significance of Richard's prison correspondence was characterized by what forensic psychologists call external validation with identity reinforcement. He was using letters from admirers and media attention to maintain his criminal identity and psychological sense of importance. Richard's mental state during his final years on death row reveals what experts call mortality acceptance with legacy obsession. He was beginning to accept that he would likely die in prison, but his psychology remained focused on maintaining his criminal reputation for posterity. His psychological response to his natural death in 2013 was characterized by what forensic psychologists call outcome avoidance with control maintenance. By dying of natural causes rather than execution, Richard's psychology maintained some final sense of control over his own fate. The psychological analysis of Richard's legal system experience reveals what experts call institutional resistance with identity preservation. Throughout his trial and imprisonment, he maintained his criminal identity and psychological sense of superiority, never accepting moral responsibility for his actions. You're now examining the lasting psychological impact of Richard Ramirez's crimes and the critical lessons his case provides for understanding and preventing similar criminal behavior. This is where criminal psychology transforms tragedy into knowledge that can protect future victims. Richard's psychological legacy in criminal psychology is characterized by what forensic experts call disorganized organized hybrid classification with methodology evolution. His case challenged traditional FBI profiling categories by demonstrating how killers could exhibit both organized and disorganized traits simultaneously. His impact on victim psychology research reveals what experts call trauma diversification with recovery complexity. Richard's attacks on victims of different ages, genders, and demographics provided crucial data about how different populations respond to and recover from extreme violence. The psychological significance of Richard's case for law enforcement training was characterized by what forensic psychologists call investigative methodology enhancement with pattern recognition improvement. His crimes taught investigators new techniques for tracking killers who deliberately vary their methods to avoid detection. Richard's influence on criminal psychology theory development reveals what experts call escalation pattern analysis with environmental factor integration. His case demonstrated how childhood trauma, environmental triggers, and substance abuse interact to create criminal behavior patterns. His psychological impact on public safety awareness was characterized by what forensic experts call community vigilance enhancement with prevention strategy development. The Night Stalker case fundamentally changed how communities approach home security and personal safety protocols. The psychological analysis of Richard's case contribution to serial killer typology shows what experts call classification system refinement with behavioral spectrum expansion. His crimes revealed that serial killers could be more psychologically complex and methodologically diverse than previously understood. Richard's legacy in forensic psychology education is characterized by what experts call case study integration with training enhancement. His crimes became essential teaching material for understanding how multiple psychological factors combine to create extreme criminal behavior. His psychological impact on victim services development reveals what forensic experts call trauma response improvement with support system enhancement. The diverse nature of his victims led to better understanding of how to provide psychological support to different trauma survivors. The psychological significance of Richard's case for juvenile intervention programs was characterized by what experts call early warning system development with prevention focus. His childhood provided clear indicators that, if recognized, might have prevented his criminal development. Richard's influence on criminal psychology research methodology reveals what experts call interdisciplinary integration with comprehensive analysis. His case demonstrated the need for combining psychological, sociological, and biological factors when studying criminal behavior. His psychological impact on law enforcement cooperation was characterized by what forensic experts call interagency coordination enhancement with information sharing improvement. The Night Stalker investigation showed how multiple jurisdictions could work together more effectively. The psychological analysis of Richard's case contribution to drug policy understanding shows what experts call substance abuse correlation with violence amplification. His crimes demonstrated how drug use can accelerate and intensify existing criminal tendencies. Richard's legacy in criminal profiling advancement is characterized by what experts call predictive accuracy improvement with behavioral analysis refinement. His case provided crucial data for developing more accurate methods of predicting criminal behavior patterns. His psychological impact on home security technology development reveals what forensic experts call prevention innovation with protection enhancement. The Night Stalker case accelerated the development of residential security systems and safety protocols. The psychological significance of Richard's case for understanding media influence was characterized by what experts call coverage effect analysis with copycat prevention. His crimes taught valuable lessons about how media reporting can influence both public safety and potential criminals. Richard's influence on criminal psychology assessment techniques reveals what experts call evaluation methodology enhancement with diagnostic accuracy improvement. His case provided crucial insights for developing better methods of assessing criminal psychological profiles. His psychological impact on correctional psychology was characterized by what forensic experts call institutional management improvement with treatment protocol development. His behavior in prison provided valuable data for managing high-risk inmates. The psychological analysis of Richard's case contribution to understanding criminal motivation shows what experts call drive analysis with behavioral prediction enhancement. His crimes revealed new insights into how psychological needs translate into criminal behavior. Richard's legacy in criminal psychology prevention programs is characterized by what experts call intervention strategy development with early identification improvement. His case provided crucial data for developing programs to identify and help at-risk individuals before they become criminals. His psychological impact on victim psychology treatment was characterized by what forensic experts call trauma therapy enhancement with recovery protocol improvement. The diverse nature of his victims led to better understanding of how to help different types of trauma survivors. The psychological significance of Richard's case for understanding criminal evolution reveals what experts call behavioral development analysis with progression pattern identification. His crimes demonstrated how criminal behavior can evolve and intensify over time. Richard's influence on criminal psychology training programs was characterized by what experts call educational curriculum enhancement with practical application improvement. His case became essential material for training future criminal psychologists and law enforcement professionals. His psychological impact on public policy development reveals what forensic experts call legislative influence with safety regulation improvement. The Night Stalker case influenced laws related to home security, victim rights, and criminal justice procedures. The psychological analysis of Richard's case contribution to understanding criminal psychology gender differences shows what experts call comparative analysis with behavioral distinction, identification. His crimes provided valuable data for understanding how male serial killers differ from female ones. Richard's legacy in criminal psychology research methodology is characterized by what experts call analytical technique advancement with comprehensive evaluation improvement. His case demonstrated the need for more sophisticated methods of analyzing criminal behavior. His psychological impact on community psychology was characterized by what forensic experts call collective trauma understanding with social recovery enhancement. The Night Stalker case provided crucial insights into how communities recover from mass traumatic events. The psychological significance of Richard's case for understanding criminal psychology. Cultural factors reveals what experts call environmental influence analysis with social context integration. His crimes demonstrated how cultural and social factors contribute to criminal development. Richard's influence on criminal psychology prevention theory was characterized by what experts call protective factor identification with intervention strategy development. His case provided crucial data for understanding what factors might prevent criminal behavior development. His psychological impact on forensic psychology methodology reveals what forensic experts call investigative technique enhancement with evidence analysis improvement. The Night Stalker case advanced methods for analyzing crime scenes and criminal behavior patterns. The psychological analysis of Richard's case shows what experts call comprehensive criminal psychology with prevention application. His crimes provided a complete picture of how childhood trauma, environmental factors, and psychological predisposition combine to create extreme criminal behavior, offering crucial insights for preventing similar cases in the future.